Molly, welcome to Shifting Culture. Excited to have you on. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
I have been fascinated with charisma for about 10 years. So I'm really excited to have you on to help me get my head around this whole topic where I I really don't know what to think. So I've wanted to dive into it. So I'm glad we're here. So you have this book, Spellbound. You take the topic of charisma, you weave it in with politics and religion, really through the history of America. And I think it's fascinating. Can you just give me why this project? Why have you opened this up for yourself and spent so long on diving into the history of charisma in America?
Right. I love that question. I suppose any book project, because you've got to live with it for a while. My first question is, will this be a vehicle for me to just learn a lot of stuff I don't know? And so really it was that for me, the opportunity to take a kind of bird's eye view of the past 400 plus years of American history and think about the ways in which religion and politics are really never siloed off, but are always intertwined. I think too, for me, as someone who's been a student of religion my whole adult life, I've been noticing more and more, with every poll that comes out, and we see, across at least most demographic categories, rates of church attendance declining, rates of people saying that they believe in God or identify with a traditional religion tend to be in the decline. It has seemed to me that most of the tools that scholars and journalists have used to track the religious impulse that humans have to try to understand human spirituality, those tools are just not very useful anymore. I don't think that just because fewer people answer yes to those typical survey questions, that means that more people are, in a totally, materialist, naturalistic frame of mind and have no longer any desire for kind of transcendent meaning. I don't think that's the case at all. It's just that impulse and that desire has gone somewhere else. And scholars are struggling to kind of catch up to that and figure out a method for studying it. And so for me, the story of charisma is one way into that. And I went into the project with this hypothesis that religious impulse, it to some degree might be landing in the context of our relationship with a particular type of compelling leader, and that story is actually entwined with the story of charisma in the New Testament sense, in the sense of that Paul describes it, right? Or that Luke describes it, and the human hunger for direct contact with the divine and a sense of
Mm,
anointing.
mm. So then what is charisma? Let's take me back into maybe the Greek definition of charisma and then what we typically think of it now, maybe even in the political sphere in America.
Really, I mean, centuries up until about 100 years ago, the word charisma was a pretty specialized theological term. I mean, as you say, originally it comes from the ancient Greek charis, meant divine gift, and it had, in the context of ancient Greek and Roman culture and society, a kind of ambivalent meaning. It could mean a gift that brought with it strength and privilege and supernatural ability, but also it could come with a sort of curse. Now, Paul, in his letters, turns this into charisma. He adds the "ma" suffix, which in the Koine Greek puts emphasis on the kind of completed state. And charisma in the New Testament, I mean, it has a range of meanings. Sometimes Paul uses it to describe the gift of grace that is core to his explanation of the gospel. And then in other contexts, he uses it to describe quite specialized gifts, whether that's the gift of tongues or interpreting tongues, prophecy, this descent of the Holy Spirit that manifests in the life of the believer in a way that is beyond the believer's control, and is this sort of unpredictable force in the life of the church that is a gift, but a bit of a scary one. Now, the word remained kind of siloed in biblical studies and theology until the sociologist Max Weber, around the turn of the 20th century, picks up the term from his colleagues in church history and finds it a really interesting way to begin to describe some of the dynamics that he is seeing in modern European and American politics and religion. And he does retain, as he's using it and trying to kind of coax his secular colleagues in this new discipline of sociology into using this kind of weird theological term, he retains a religious dimension to it. I mean, he explicitly talks about charisma as this quality that a leader has in which followers are persuaded that he has a supernatural gift or set of powers, and he is able to prosper his followers in some way that convinces them that he is a chosen one. And Weber is a little ambiguous, but he does he mean this religious language as a metaphor? I don't think entirely. I think he is grasping for the word charisma to describe something that eludes standard materialist, rationalist explanations. And this is, I think, why it has become, as it sort of filtered into, well, his works were translated into English from the German, and it kind of filtered into American academia and journalism. And now it's become this popular term that I think we still throw around when we're not quite sure what we are seeing. There is some
Yeah.
dynamic unfolding between a leader and followers. Usually we're on the outside. We don't quite get it.
Yep.
And it doesn't line up along the lines of, a quid pro quo of an attractive policy, or material wealth changing hands, or military force. There's something else going on, and we're grasping for it, and we punt essentially to that term charisma.
Yeah. And so what is then going on? Is charisma then, if we're throwing this term around, a lot of people would throw it around with, I think, hype, with charm, maybe with somebody that is magnetic in some way. What do you think that we're trying to get at?
When I started this project, I really thought I would be writing a lot about interpersonal charm and celebrity. I thought that all the subjects I would gravitate to would be amazing orators and really good looking and have sex appeal and be just the center of every party. And I didn't find that to be the case really at all. And indeed, one of the patterns that came with charisma as I was beginning to kind of suss it out from the 1600s to the present is this flip side, that is the total revulsion that people often feel if they are outside the thrall of the charismatic leader. And what accounts for that, right? What accounts for that quite polarizing quality? So what I found was that while sure, some of the people I write about in the book, usual suspects, people like, John F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King Jr., that, what you might expect me to deal with, some of them certainly had these qualities of amazing rhetorical skills and interpersonal magnetism. But the real through line is the ability to invite potential followers into a story. I found that the heart of charisma is this invitation to listen to this new account of reality that totally changes your perception of your own situation, your own suffering, your own frustrations, and offers you a role in a narrative going forward that is more attractive, that gives you a greater sense of personal agency, but also the protection and sense of safety that comes with knowing you are part of now a bigger force, a bigger story. You're turning over some part of your responsibility to this individual, this movement, and what this charismatic leader is offering you is more compelling than the other stories that are available in the cultures. I really think that as humans, we're storytelling and story seeking creatures, and we're always
Yes.
trying to plug our chaos into a narrative that makes sense. And
Yeah.
that's really what I found to be the through line, all the way from the Puritans of Massachusetts Bay to
Mhm.
our modern
Mhm.
social media TikTok culture.
Yeah. And I've always thought that because we are story creatures, that's how we make meaning. That's where we find our identity is in the stories that we tell. And because I think that our age that we're living in and the age for a long time in America has been an identity less age where we're grasping for identities. And these stories really compel us to say, okay, I can find my place there. I find meaning there. It's okay. And it seems to me as you start out in your book and you walk through the Puritans and Europeans coming into America and some it seems and then you just go through each of these stages in America, it seems to be a like thinking of against the culture, the charismatic leader is giving you a different story than what the predominant culture is at the time. How does the relationship between the culture of what's happening and then saying you're outside of this and I'm going to compel you into a different story that actually includes the person that is not included in the culture that is happening at the moment?
Yeah, this is a really interesting dynamic. There's this sort of dialectical relationship between charismatic leaders and kind of the mainstream threads in the culture, and they can't be so distant and weird vis-a-vis the culture that they're in that they are illegible. But on the other hand, they do have to have some kind of innovation and kind of cut left when the culture's going right and this kind of thing. And certainly, I found a kind of across the big span of American history, I found in different periods a kind of rise of a particular type of charismatic leader who really a type of story, you could say, that speaks to the particular anxieties of that era, and then the kind of reactions to that, and then the pendulum would swing again. I mean, maybe one particularly interesting example is Joseph Smith, the founder of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, who is born shortly after the turn of the 19th century in New England, in this context of sort of frustrated, down on their luck, post-Puritan New England Protestantism. And I think a great deal of his genius is this ability to combine and also sense the weaknesses of the kind of prevailing political and religious culture. So there's a way in which the revelation that he reveals that becomes the foundation of the Mormon Church, it answers these uneasy paradoxes in traditional kind of Orthodox Christianity, especially as expressed in the kind of Calvinistic strain that is so influential in New England. So, in traditional Christianity, there is this tension between human free will and divine sovereignty, especially in the more predestinarian version. Well, Joseph Smith's faith is one that it's the ultimate free will religion. It absolutely enables the believer to take the reins, but through declaring faith and going through the steps that he lays out to really achieve the heights of celestial exaltation, in a way that I think is absolutely empowering and appealing to this kind of pioneer class of sort of New Englanders who are looking for a new life, many of whom
Yeah.
are sort of frustrated with their situations, as they've inherited them from their parents' generation. And there also is this kind of dynamic that I think is often left out of our understandings of the foundation of the Mormon Church, which is the degree to which it's intertwined with this mission to evangelize and join with and sort of supersede the indigenous people of the North American continent. I mean, the first edition of the Book of Mormon, has on the title page, this is a message to the Lamanites, which is, the kind of ancestor people in Joseph Smith's kind of cosmology, of modern day Native Americans. And so there's a way in which all, kind of European extracted Americans are thinking about their relationship to the native people of the continent, and that's a broader story. But it is absolutely baked into this vision for kind of conquering the continent with divine authority. And indeed, the first Mormons, and this is where New Testament charisma kind of gets bound up with political charisma. The first Mormons spoke in tongues all the time. So this is another thing that we forget about Mormons, because later on in the church's history, they put the kibosh on that. And initially, a lot of these manifestations of tongues are, in the Mormon understanding, something like indigenous languages, meant for this vision of a new kind of American spirituality that I think speaks to the anxiety of European Americans who are sort of wrestling with this Calvinistic heritage, and also wrestling and feeling uncertain about their place vis-a-vis the native people of the continent. And Smith, packages all of this in a way that, as if you read the Book of Mormon, it sounds like the King James language, right? It sounds like the King James Bible. And so he is using the idiom of kind of Protestant, biblical, scripturally based Christianity, but he's innovating it. And I mean, I will say too, he was a great case study for me to get at the question of the role of the individual charismatic leader, and how important he is as compared to the message. Smith is remembered as this incredibly magnetic presence, like quite tall for the age, electric blue eyes. But I found other, records from people who met him in person saying he was an absolute charlatan and a creep, and he had these weird fat hands, and like, why does anyone follow this guy, right? And then the most striking kind of data point for me was thinking about the thousands of new LDS converts whom Mormon missionaries made in Britain and Canada, who moved to Nauvoo, Illinois, right, which was then the Mormon sort of base of operations, without ever laying eyes on this guy,
Yeah.
Joseph Smith, right? So there is something about the story. Smith is absolutely important, don't get me wrong, but it's really the Mormon story that speaks to that early Republic moment in a powerful way.
Interesting. So, why do you think some people then, with these charismatic leaders or these charismatic movements that happen, why do you think that some people are often repelled by them, and some people are so attracted to them? What did you find in these things where those two dynamics are at play at the same time?
I think this is where, as a historian, I always have to remember that, there's this mandate, right, to make sense of history and look for these big patterns. But the caution is always that history is a story of idiosyncratic individuals.
Yeah.
And so I think to really get into the anatomy of these movements, and why is it that they divide families? I mean, whether you're talking about, the 19th century spiritualist trance speakers, who, these women who come into an auditorium in a state of trance, supposedly, and some people hear them and think, wow, the spirit of Benjamin Franklin is really speaking through
Mm,
this 16-year-old girl right now, and the person sitting next to them, it thinks this is all absolute humbug.
yeah.
All the way to the 1970s, I got really into the story of the following of the Guru Maharaji and the Divine Light Mission, and these kind of
Hmm.
former activists who gravitate to him, to the horror of their friends who have the same story. I mean, I think you have to dig into the biographies of individuals, and perhaps the one pattern that is important, whether we're talking about the 17th century or we're talking about today, is an individual's relationship to institutions and sources of traditional authority. And I suspect that those of us who have been let down, disillusioned, hurt in some way by those frameworks, that we've built as humans to give us a narrative to plug into, that leaves us perhaps in a frame of mind where we are more interested in alternatives, whereas those of us who have found homes in those other forms of intellectual authority perhaps look askance at challenges to them.
So it's so interesting how one person in a family could say yes, the other person says no. That is just, it divides people. And of course, we're seeing that today in with Trump. Like, you have families divided all the time. You have churches divided. You have, communities. Everybody's divided. Is this a new phenomenon where we say there's such polar opposites that we're so diametrically opposed? One is repulsed by it, the other is not. Is it new? Or is it something that we could actually learn from what has happened in the past?
I think in broad terms, it's not new, and that this is a response that communities have to every single charismatic leader I write about in the book, from the Puritan heretic, as she was deemed, Anne Hutchinson, who divides the community of Boston in the 1630s, as you say, all the way up to Donald Trump. It seems to me that what has made the polarization feel more pungent, more kind of all consuming in our own time, is the way in which our reaction to these figures is embedded in a broader context of multiple kinds of polarization. So, to take the opposite example, a generation or a bit more ago, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party both were home to people who would call themselves conservatives and liberals of a certain type, right? So they both parties had their more conservative wings. They had internal disagreement, because of kind of the sorting that's happened since really the 1970s, although you could trace it back to the 40s if you like, we've seen a much closer alignment in our own time between the sort of partisan identity and these ideological categories, in a way that lends the ideological polarization more power. And this has happened at the very same time that we've seen the decline of Americans' affiliation with traditional forms of organized religion, what people commonly refer to as secularization. Although I would say that term secularization, it really it describes our eroding relationships with all institutions, not just
Yeah.
not just religion. But I think it absolutely is the case that humans seeking the thing that a generation ago more of us got in the context of religion, a sense of transcendent meaning, of a tribal identity that was at least a
Yeah.
bit attenuated by the universalist claims of Christianity, when Christians lived them out. More and more people are bereft of that, and they find it in politics,
Mm,
which has lent
yeah.
this kind of religious, fundamentalist fervor to some of
Yeah.
these Thanksgiving table conversations.
Yeah, that's good. I would love for you to just walk us through, in broad brushstrokes, this history of charismatic leaders and charismatic movements. And, in your book, you go through 5 different movements that you title. Wh- what happened, and how was the next era a response to the first era that they were responding to, and these charismatic leaders and movements were happening? So, as talking through prophets and conquerors and so on and so forth.
Yeah, great. Well, the book really, it begins in the aftermath of the Reformation, and there's this way in which I see this story as an outworking of the long tail of the Reformation in the American context, which supercharged some of the kind of the democratic, schismatic energy of the Reformation. The era of the prophets, which I begin in the early 1600s, and that takes us up really to the Revolutionary period, is a time when the categories and practices and identity of old world religious groups, they still have a fair amount of purchase on
Hmm.
the European Americans who've begun to settle the eastern part of the United States. And the prophets are these figures who begin to challenge those categories, and sense, I think, perhaps ahead of the people who are kind of in charge of the culture, so to speak. They sense the new situation that is the case in the colonies. This, even in Puritan Massachusetts, a degree of institutional weakness and decentralization that is different from, what these kind of hierarchies and institutions were set up to deal with in the old world. And what I detected in that early moment, and this became a category that I found myself carrying along, into the later centuries, is what the Puritans would call the quest for the desire for assurance, the desire for a personal, confirming, visceral sense that I am one of the elect, that I am one whom God has chosen to save. And that, there's this tension, of course, in Christianity, and the Puritans are deep in this tension between the conviction that you are saved by grace, and it is free grace, and it is not up to you, on one hand. On the other hand, if you are a Christian, the Holy Spirit has planned works for you to do, right? Like, this is what Paul says in Ephesians. And so it ought to show, there ought to be some proof, but be careful not to let that become works righteousness. And the Puritan magistrates kind of live in that tension, and see correctly that you need that tension if you want to create a governable, peaceful society, really from scratch. And Hutchinson sees that in the context of the unexpected constant threat of mortality, especially for women, facing this, and every time, they are expecting a child, and just the general kind of challenges of colonial life. I think she sees the desire for a direct line to the Holy Spirit, so to speak. And
Yeah.
I think that Americans in later periods hunger for some version of that. I mean, they may be wholly outside the categories of traditional Christianity and not call it divine assurance, but one way of describing what charismatic leaders offer is as a kind of assurance that you are on the right side of the cosmic story. But the era of the prophets, who are kind of throwing stones at old world institutions, provokes a backlash, certainly a desire to set up laws and institutions that corral these threats. And also we see, in as we get into the revolutionary period and the early 19th century, a desire to build, to conquer. And so I call that second period the age of the conquerors. And I mean it not just in the sense of someone like Andrew Jackson, and
Yeah.
Napoleon, who, although of course he's not operating in the American context, he is the reference point for what a leader should be. I mean it also in the sense of metaphysical conquest. And so I got really interested in the spiritualists, and in this kind of optimistic vision of progress that starts in this world but doesn't end with death. And it is a kind of, it got tied up with all kinds of progressive political ambitions as well. So many spiritualists who were interested in communication with spirits in the hereafter were also, involved in the abolitionist movement and women's suffrage and so forth. And so this is kind of in the context too of the aftermath of the Civil War, when the country is literally rebuilding. But I carry the story to the third period of the group I call the agitators, who are kind of kissing cousins to the prophets, and that they are anti-institutional. Their impulse is to challenge, if not destroy, in the face of this kind of encroaching presence of institutions and federal government power. In the lives of Americans. So I write about the Pentecostals in this context, and the rise of charisma as a term that begins to enter the discourse. I do think that Max Weber is thinking about charisma and what he's observing in the tension between sort of the encroaching, what he calls iron cage of modernity, right? The bureaucracies of the 20th century, and his kind of ambivalence about that, and the Pentecostals' reactions against overly rationalistic, modernized Christianity, their desire for direct power. So the stories are intertwined. This takes us up to World War II and the agitators kind of paving the way for the rise of fascist demagoguery that is one of the main plot points of World War II. And I think that's what allows the backlash that comes in the 50s and 60s, which I call the age of the experts, just really the only period in American history when Americans have been inclined to enter into a charismatic relationship with nerdy eggheads. It is the sort of apogee of, technocrats. It's the brain trust of JFK. Even someone like Martin Luther King Jr. is so effective because he's able to kind of blend the cool rationality, the sort of Boston University PhD vibe he could give off when he wanted, with that prophetic Black Christian tradition. And there's this sense, because the experts sell this story to the American people, that technology and scientific discovery and the growth of higher education, this is all in service of Americans writ large. This is a juggernaut that's going to carry all of us forward as citizens. And it's a story that Americans buy for a time. But I think for reasons that have to do partly with broader social factors, and then also a degree of sort of self-sabotage on the part of academics that really undermines the credibility of universities, they set themselves up for a fall and land us where we are now, which is what I call the age of the gurus, which is a period of really unprecedented institutional weakness and power accruing to individuals who are in that tradition of the prophets and the agitators. They are generally destroyers, but they have far more influence than those earlier epochs because our institutions are so weak right now.
Yeah. So as we so it feels like, if Trump is a guru and follower in the time of gurus, feels like it's a destroying type of thing. Like we're trying to destroy some of the governmental institutions at the moment, and remake it something new. But it's also harkening back to the 1950s of like, let's go back to some of that. How do you see that right now play into his rhetoric of like, let's go back into some of these things, but then let's actually tear down a lot of what's happening as well? How
Yeah,
does that?
that's a really perceptive question, because there is this nostalgia in the rhetoric of Trump and his supporters, but the area they are hearkening back to is an era of unprecedented federal investment in higher education and fairly secure cultural authority for a small number of mainstream media outlets that sought explicitly to give justice to both sides and aim for something approaching scientific objectivity, right? And so there's so many important features to that period that are quite at odds, I think, with the vision that Trump is advocating now. And I think there's a desire to totally untether one piece of that era from the really important but perhaps less obvious structural dynamics. So I don't know that you can do that, right? What make an era, what gives its overall cultural integrity, has to do with the interaction between those two things. But I think that we're in a, I mean, I'm really worried about civilization. I mean, I think I'm struggling to. I don't want to sound like a complete pessimist, but I do think, I mean, for some of the reasons that you identified that have to do with the way we construct our identity as humans, and how atomized we are. They're in a healthy kind of cultural ecosystem. You have charismatic leaders who are challenging institutions and other forms of authority, but you then also have robust institutions and forms of kind of family and local and organizational connection. And so it's an ecosystem that has a certain balance. And I think that balance is completely broken right now. And so we're not really equipped to to learn and engage with these charismatic leaders in a way that I think can in principle be healthy, if you also have these other sources of information and ways to judge, whether the story you're being told resembles reality or not.
Yes. So, how do we know what reality is when we're in an age where reality is being questioned? But I do think that there is this spiritual age, and I think people are being wooed by God. That people are finding faith and spirituality in a lot of different things, but the reality is being shifted. We don't know what to stand on. So, can we have a healthy relationship with charismatic leaders and movements if it still is at an age where everything seems untethered? I just think that reality and everything is untethered at the moment. Because if I think we're untethered, that means that, man, the culture could shift very quickly, which it has, right? And it shifts quickly into following one charismatic leader. And if we're in the era of gurus, like we're going, oh, this guru didn't actually give me everything I needed, so I'm going to go follow another guru really quickly, and I'm going to go over here. It feels like we're untethered. How do we tether ourselves? How do we ground ourselves so that we could have a healthy relationship with charismatic leaders and the ideologies and stories they're trying to sell us?
I hear in what you're saying two really important questions. One is, I think, how do we maximize our chances of having an accurate picture of the world? And the second is, how do we accurately understand our own impulses and desires, right? Because part of the trouble is that, especially since the 1960s, although I think this is a strand in American thought that goes back at least to Ralph Waldo Emerson and the Transcendentalists, and this sense of self-reliance and kind of connection with reality that is located just in your individual experiences. We've made a kind of cult of personal authenticity, um, and as if there is in each of us like this little flame that we're born with, and the definition of a meaningful life is the cultivation of that flame into a kind of bounded conflagration, and that is self-expression. And we never pause to ask, where have I gotten this idea of what authenticity is? Like, who taught me to, for example, elevate sexual fulfillment and desire as like the main frame of who I am as a person, right? That has a history, and we don't interrogate it enough. And then and then there is this problem of the way charismatic gurus have maximized our very atomized media landscape, and we're all kind of at sea. We're in our own media silo. I think the key question to pose, when you find yourself lending more and more authority to a particular individual, is to say, is this individual acting as a gateway for me into a broader tradition and a broader community with structures and a sense of its own history and a system for accountability? Or is this leader saying, I am the way and the truth and the life, and everything stops with me, and I personally am pulling back the veil for you, and don't listen to those other voices,
Yeah.
right? So I think if it's the latter, that is the sign of a poisonous relationship. I am
Yeah.
encouraged by the beginnings of signs we see of the re-engagement, at least among college educated younger men, with traditional religion.
Yeah.
With Catholicism, with established Protestant churches, with Orthodoxy. I mean, that movement is really interesting. And part of what's encouraging to me about that is that it's putting these lonely, atomized individuals, especially young men who've been told by the culture that they are toxic, right? That
Yeah.
there's no healthy way to be a young man. It's putting them into contact with these broader communities and institutions that have these long traditions of how to think about the classic human problems. So
Yeah.
that has the beginnings of a kind of a correction to the
Hmm.
perhaps the attraction of internet gurus, of Andrew Tate. Or, I mean, I think Jordan Peterson is a really interesting cultural figure who is
Yeah.
proving for many individuals a kind of gateway to organized Christianity, traditional Christianity. I think it probably is a problem if one stays, just listening to Peterson as an
Yeah.
individual, as your guide for all life questions.
Yes. So I want to, how did this affect your faith as you studied charisma and the history of charisma and charismatic leaders, and especially leaders within Christianity and spirituality as they're guiding in different ways and being affected by cultural aspects of what is happening in the world? And like, how did that affect your faith, and how does that intertwine between your faith and what you think of the broader culture?
It's something I'm still thinking about. I became a Christian in 2022 when I had written about 2/3 of this book. So it really, my own personal spiritual process really kind of interrupted my
Yeah.
my scholarly work. And on the one hand, the book is about the religious impulses that we all have, and the ways those impulses mutate and where they land absent the normal landing places of organized religion. And I have always thought my whole career as a agnostic, raised totally secular historian and journalist, I've always thought of religion in this way, as this like fundamental component of what it is to be human. So that is not like an epiphany that I came to after, coming to Christ myself. But there's a way in which when I step back and look at my path, I think, well, why did I think I would be exempt, in a sense, from this thing that I think is fundamental to humans? Like I too have had this tropism toward transcendent meaning, right? And so it's helped me, I think, see the way in which every historian, I mean, I'm not some like, you know I don't go in for like the postmodern nonsense about how there's no truth, and like none of us can be, of course none of us can be perfectly objective. There's no view from nowhere, but I certainly think it's possible to, and most historians, every historian who studies religion has some kind of personal relationship to it, right? It's just that there's a bit of a double standard. I think we think about those scholars who are, personally devout as being incapable of disconnecting themselves enough from their own location vis-a-vis the religious community that they're studying, compared to atheist or agnostic scholars who also have have a set of convictions, and certainly I did, and I probably was not pressed to interrogate those enough by the culture in a way that I now feel I am. I would say, I followed in the book the conventions that professional historians follow, and that includes historians who are personally believers in the supernatural and those who are not, which is to say a lot of the book is about crazy stuff, right? Like
Yeah.
the Holy Spirit doing stuff, at least that's what believers think. And I narrate it, and I do my best to get into the heads of, what people lying on the carpet, in Toronto in 1994 at the, inception of the Toronto Blessing, this massive revival with global implications that we don't talk about enough. And I kind of stay out of the question in the book of what is happening. I quote one guy who was there who said, listen, like our job at this revival was to just create a safe box for whatever God is or is not doing. And he says, some of this is the Holy Spirit, some of this is people working out their own emotional issues, some of this might be
Mhm.
demonic. It's not up to us. We're trying to make sure no one gets hurt. And I almost thought that that's like the right attitude for the historian to take. But as a scholar of religion, I would say becoming a Christian has awakened me to the obligation to take the supernatural seriously in a new way. And it's the process by which you can do that in the secular space. So I wrote about the problem of how to or whether one can prove miraculous contemporary claims of healing. Wrote about this for the New York Times. And the process by which you can engage a subject like that in a secular newspaper is of course different from if I were writing for a Christian publication. But I have been, I don't know, awakened to it as an important scholarly lens in a way that is different from how I thought about these things before.
Hmm. If you look at then Jesus was a very charismatic figure and drew lots of people to him, found a following, and it's a movement that is still going on today that he founded, and this charismatic movement. What is different in the story that Jesus is telling than the ideologies and the stories that either political or religious charismatic leaders have been telling that were a little bit off and got people off on the wrong track?
I I think that in some ways Jesus, well, in every way, Jesus breaks these categories. I mean, in a sense, he's the true guru. Like he's making every guru since then has sort of made claims, messianic claims. But if you're a Christian, you believe, well, Jesus was making those claims because he was the Messiah. But maybe it's interesting here, especially trying to make that legible for non Christians who are trying to engage with the story of Jesus and are not convinced of those claims. Maybe it's interesting to engage with some Trinitarian theology here and think about the way in which, yes, Jesus is making very bold claims for himself. And he is saying, you need to see all reality through me. And if you do that, I'm going to turn it upside down, and then you will see the truth. But he is the gateway to the Trinity, to something, that we have to think of in broader terms. And he already, in his earthly ministry, is also setting up the beginnings, the foundation stones of an institution, and roles for very flawed humans to play. And that, I think that is where my I became a Christian already very familiar with the way in which, like, the through line of the history of Christianity is, one of the through lines is absolutely human depravity.
Yeah.
And frankly, I was convinced of the doctrine of original sin long before I even became a theist. And that maybe doesn't make any sense, but
Yeah.
it's true. And so I think that Christian theological claim, I mean, it's also, I think it's helpful for making sense of what has unfolded in the life of the community that Jesus founded in the 2,000 years
Yeah.
since then.
Yeah. That's good. I have a few questions there, Molly, at the end, because this has been a fascinating conversation. I wish I could talk to you longer and go deeper, because I love it. It's so
Oh,
good.
me too.
But what's one hope that you have for the readers of Spellbound? What do you hope that this book provides and gives people?
I hope it provides a sense that while there are certain features of our current moment that are unprecedented and weird and new to the human experience, those features do not override the continuities that I think do connect us, certainly with the past 4 centuries of history, but also with deeper patterns that just characterize the way humans are as we struggle to live together in community and fight over what it means to flourish. Sometimes we make too much of the rise of the internet and social media, and it makes us think that we are more special in our current age than we are, and that, I suppose, can be both comforting and depressing, right? Because in some ways it means that the dynamics we're seeing are deeply ingrained in who we are as a species. But there's also a sense of, I don't know, kinship across the eras. And I think with that can come a kind of self-awareness that allows, I hope, readers who are themselves religious to see some of the dynamics that can go awry in their own communities, and readers who are secular can see that there is not a firewall between them and people who identify as religious, and that actually in so many cases we are living through expressions of very similar, if not the same, dynamics and tendencies. And so maybe that chasm that we can sometimes feel in our secular culture between people who are religious and people who are not is not as much of a chasm as we make it out to be.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. If you go back to your 21-year-old self, Molly, what advice would you give?
Wow. Make it a life habit to read long books. I'm so worried
Mm,
about that. I think I've done okay at that myself, but I
mm,
I chose a line of work where it's privileged, and that's not true for most people. I
yeah.
suppose too, I would say don't think that you can learn about a tradition without submitting to it.
Mm,
I think when I was 21, I and for most of my life till recently, I was susceptible to the message we get from our culture that spirituality is kind of a smorgasbord, and you can either sort of make up your own, or you can get a sense of what Buddhism is like, or Anglicanism, or Eastern Orthodoxy, by sort of dipping into it. And I don't think that's how it works. And
mm,
I still, my tendency is still to put too much emphasis on kind of head learning. And I wish I had begun to think earlier about the need to recognize the limits of your own understanding and take the time to just submit to a community before you think you
mm.
understand it.
Yeah, that's really good. That's really good. Anything you've been reading or watching lately you could recommend?
I recently discovered a pair of novels that were written in the 1990s that have just blew my mind. These are two, and I'm not a science fiction person ordinarily, but these are two science fiction novels by an author named Mary Doria Russell. The first is called The Sparrow, the second is called Children of God. And it's about a Jesuit mission to another planet and the
Mm,
species that the team of missionaries and lay people meet there. And it is an amazing
mm,
transportation into another world that grapples with the big questions of the problem of evil and what makes us human, and the moral compromises that we make as a society and don't even think about until we have a mirror of something very different held up against us. It's also awesome as a series of audiobooks. I can't recommend it highly enough.
awesome. You're the second person to recommend that on the podcast here. And so
That's
I
fascinating.
it is fascinating. I'm like, that's interesting. That's really interesting. I haven't checked it out yet, so I really have to go and read them now because, man, hey, if if you're the second one, like, it's got to be something.
Yeah, I think the
You
Holy
got to
Spirit. I think the
be.
Holy Spirit wants you to at least listen to the books on your next road trip or something.
Yes, yes. Molly, how can people go out and get Spellbound? And is there anywhere else you'd like to point people to?
The usual places, Amazon and Barnes and Noble or your local bookstore. And I'm in the process of getting a proper website up, probably be up by the time listeners hear this. My name is luckily not that common. So if people Google Molly Worthen, they will find me immediately.
Perfect. Well, Molly, thank you for this conversation. Thank you for diving into the history of charisma in America and our both our political and religious systems and how we are meaning-making creatures, story creatures that really want to follow some ideologies and what people have found as a story that is actually a say contrast to the era that they were living in, saying we want to make some meaning for people that maybe have been on the margins, have been somewhere that have not been included. I really find this fascinating. And then our role in how do we live faithfully as followers of Jesus in the midst of charismatic leaders and charisma and ideologies and the shifting waves of the pendulum swings of culture and stories and where we find our meaning and how we actually stay rooted and faithful to Jesus as identity and having him as an identity maker for us instead of all the stories that we're trying to be told. So it was fascinating for me and I loved it. I think this whole book would make an incredible podcast series of stories. It would be amazing to
Oh, I
dive
love that
into,
idea. That sounds like
and
fun.
it was good. So thank you. It was a fantastic conversation.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.